Welcome back. In this video, we're going to mix two different shaders together to create a brick wall shader. So I'm back in the tilesend.blend file, and you can see that I've slightly changed the colour of the tiles here to a yellow colour from the black tiles we had before. And I'm going to use this file as the basis for our brick texture, just because we already have a plane in place and it's easy enough just to duplicate this material and change it to bricks. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change to an outdoor HDRI and turn off these lights. And then I'm going to add a new light into the scene. So let's turn the gizmos back on. Let's go to light and sun and just move this up a little bit. And we're going to rotate it in X and just point it right towards our object. Now our object at the moment has this tiles map on it, which I can mark as an asset. I've actually marked it as an asset in the course materials file, so I don't have to really worry about that here. So I'm just going to get rid of it. But make sure you mark yours as an asset. We're going to call this material bricks. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this principled node. I'm going to duplicate this down here. Shift Control right click between these and create a mix shader. So this mix shader is going to determine where on our material we're going to have this shader and where we're going to have this shader, and we use a factor for that. We're going to be creating a mask for that factor using the brick texture node. Now, just so that things look a little bit clearer, let's just add in a brick color here. And on this one, let's just make this grey. So this is our mortar texture. And you can see that we have our two shaders mixing together. Now, just so we can see exactly what's happening here, let's grab our brick texture node and we'll look at our factor. And you can see this is a perfect mask for masking these two different areas. We'll just plug this factor straight in here and look at our final result. And immediately you can see where we're going with this. We're going to have a shader for our brick and a shader for our mortar. Use Ctrl T to add texture coordinate and mapping nodes. We'll delete the mapping node and we'll plug the UVs into the vector from the texture coordinate. Now I just want to change my brick texture slightly. So I'm going to go into brick width and change that to 0.6 and the height 0.2, just because I prefer this wider brick. And I also want to make the mortar size a lot smaller. So I'm going to take that to 0.01. Now the mortar smoothing itself, we don't have to worry too much about. And in fact, you can see that we actually get this little gradient there that I'm not super into. I don't really want to have that. So I'm just going to take the mortar smoothing off entirely. That might be something we would adjust later. The scale is also a little bit too big, so we'll take that to about 2.5. The next thing I want to do is maybe just add in that squash. So let's do 0.5 every 6 layers, just so we've got a little bit of variety in our material. And I'll turn off these overlays so they don't distract us too much. Now, one downside about using this technique is it's really hard to get a nice normal map for the bricks. Now, in general, this brick texture doesn't really give us a good normal map anyway, unless we're using a lot of mortar smoothing. So if you imagine this brick being extruded out of this wall, we would have a flat area on the tops and the sides of the brick, and normal maps really need an angle to work, which is one reason why you might want to use mortar smoothing, because it creates that angle in your normal map. But I don't really want to have to go down that road. So instead, we're going to use displacement. So using this map or this map, I have a mini challenge for you. So your mini challenge here is to enable displacement mapping on this object, connect up a displacement node and get your displacement working. So think back to one of our previous videos where we discussed displacement. It was the image-based shader video. Pause the video and have a go and see if you can get that working. Okay, so how did you do with getting displacement working? Did you manage it? In case you didn't, there's a few steps that we have to take. We have to make sure we're in cycles, and you should be in cycles anyway. We have to make sure our feature set is set to experimental. We need to have a subdivision surface modifier on our object. We set it to simple so we don't get this distortion. And we click adaptive subdivision. Next, we add in our displacement node, so vector displacement. We'll just put this down below mix shader and plug it into displacement and material output. We'll look at our result. At the moment, you can't see anything happening because we don't have anything plugged into our height. Now, at the moment, let's grab this color and just plug it into our height and see what happens. So let's look at our shader. And still nothing happens. What's the final step? We need to go to our material properties and enable displacement. Now at this stage you might notice some shading issues. If that's the case, just right click on your object and change to auto smooth or to flat shading. And there we go, we get our result. Now you can see because I'm using this texture here and all these bricks are different colours, we are getting all our bricks coming out at different amounts. That might be something you want, it might be something you don't want. I'm going to show you how to clean that up in a second, but before that let's just make sure our displacement looks good enough. So at the moment, if we go into render settings and go to subdivision, we can see that our viewport dicing is set to 8 pixels. I think my system's just about fast enough that I could get away with using 2 pixels for that. And yeah, you can see that we're getting a much nicer result there. But yeah, you can see all the bricks are coming out at different heights. So what I'll do is I'll just go in here. I'm going to grab a converter, math node, plug this in, and we're going to use that greater than trick. So we know our mortar is black, so we can just use a threshold of 0. And now we get that nice black and white mask. And now all our bricks come out at the exact same height. Now, this is probably giving you some little hints of how you can maybe make your brick wall a little bit more irregular by having your bricks come out at different heights. And that is a really good trick. Now, one thing I do notice here is our mortar is really, really deep. So let's change this scale and bring the scale down quite a bit. I think maybe to around about there should be good. Now, talking about mortar, let's start working on our actual materials themselves. So I'm going to close this brick texture for the moment, and this is going to be our mortar, and we're just going to start working on that. So let's grab a noise texture. We'll plug in our UVs, and this is just going to be super simple. We're not really going to go into a massive amount of detail here. We want a bump map for our normal. Let's look at this result. So the first noise texture we're going to use is going to be quite a low scale, something like this, maybe a little bit larger. Use Control and Shift and D and duplicate this. And this one is going to have a much higher scale. Let's take that to about 100. More detail, more roughness. We're going to use Control Shift, right click to drag between these two. We're going to use Multiply in here. Look at our result. You can see that we can increase that factor. And we're going to plug this into our bump and see our result. So this is it if it's just the mortar we're looking at. So I think I need a couple of little adjustments here. Let's decrease that multiply factor so we can get more of this noise texture. Let's take off some of the roughness and decrease that scale a little bit as well. So let's actually look at that. What are we getting here? I think this is around about what I want. Yeah, I think that's around about what I want. So what's happening when we add this in? Okay, yeah, so that is what I want. Now if we look at our final result, you can see a lot of that detail kind of gets lost just because we're only seeing small amounts of it. But that's absolutely okay, as long as we've got a little bit of variety in heights. And I quite like the result of that. So this is essentially our mortar at the moment. One thing is we want to take our roughness up quite high on this. Our base color, again, we could duplicate this noise texture here. Have a look at that, increase the scale quite a bit. More detail, more roughness. And we'll just plug this into our base color. And that way now we have a little bit of variety in the color and not just the bump. And I think that looks okay. For our brick, we're going to do something kind of similar. Let's duplicate this noise texture. This is going to be our base kind of granular texture that we're going to use on this. So let's grab our bump node again. Plug this into our height, plug this into our normal. We're going to try and stick to this mix shader from now on. So at the moment, that looks not too bad. I think I maybe want this scale up even higher. Let's just take it all the way up to 1000. More roughness. Okay, so now it's getting to the point where it's just really, it's just a rough surface. We're not getting too much of that noise texture really. Let's see, about 0.9. Yeah, about 0.9 should be good. Now we want to layer another bump map on top of this, but instead of using the technique where we used a mix node, what we're going to do is we're going to do a daisy chain. So it's worth noting that when we daisy chain bump maps, what we can do is we can create a completely additive and subtractive system. So if we have light values in our bump map, they will increase the height of the bump, whereas if we have dark values, they will decrease the height of the bump. Usually if we use something like multiply or add, it will only add values. We won't get that subtractive value as well. So by daisy chaining our bump maps together, we have total control over layering different bumps together, and we don't have to worry about using several different mix nodes to get our additions and subtractions. So we're going to duplicate this bump node. We are going to add in a wave texture. I'll just put this on top. I'll plug this UV in here. We'll grab this color and we'll plug it into the height of this bump map. You can see that when we added this second bump node in, it went normal to normal. Now we can add height on top of it. So you can see how we can affect that. We'll keep that at 100% just now and we'll look at this texture. So what we want to do is we want to give some kind of variety to these bricks, some kind of scrape marks across them. I'm going to change this to Y, change the scale to maybe about 80. I think maybe we could stand to put that up a little bit higher. Let's try 100. I'm going to add a bunch of distortion to these. Not too much, maybe around about 3.5. Maybe increase the detail a little bit. The detail scale, I think we don't really want to touch that. Let's take that to 1. Detail roughness, let's see. Yeah, I think I need that up a little bit. Let's try 0.75. That's not too bad. Okay, so now we've got a nice kind of variety on our brick. We're just getting a nice kind of texture on those. At this point, you might want to adjust the strength of that. If you want to increase or decrease, you can see that we can decrease this normal map independent of this normal. So let's take that to about halfway. And the next thing I want to do is I want to just change this color a little bit. So the way I'm going to do that is very simple. We'll just grab a mix color node. We'll drag this color in here. I'm going to set this to multiply. Plug this into base color. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this color here as our factor and just change this to something a bit darker. So what this does is it uses this brick texture, which has a variety of different shades or values of grey, and uses that to change the values of these bricks just by layering this darker colour on top using multiply. So we get a lot more variety in our brick, and you can see there that now we get something that looks a lot nicer. And that's essentially our brick texture. Okay, so it's challenge time. So your challenge is just to frame up some groups of nodes to clean up the node tree and make it more understandable. Name and colour your nodes so you can see at a glance exactly what your different groups do, and mark your final shader as an asset once you're happy with it. So pause the video there and have a go at that. Okay, so I hope you managed to do that challenge without any issue. This is how I would tackle just cleaning up this node tree a little bit. So I'm just going to squeeze this one down a little bit by hitting this arrow. Let's just grab all these nodes and frame them up. And this is going to be our mortar. So let's hit N and just call this mortar. Now, since our mortar is grey, I'm just going to keep this set at grey. And let's grab all our brick nodes, frame those up. And we'll just call this brick. And the colour here, I'm just going to pick a colour from our brick itself. And I think that's really all there is to it on this one. There's nothing else we can really change. I'm not a big fan of framing up displacement and material output nodes and things like that are greater than, we can just squeeze down to make it a little bit neater. And our brick texture, well, I think I will open that up and just put it in here. One last little tip I'll give you is if you use Control and right click and drag through a whole bunch of these nodes, you can cut them off, but if you use Shift and right click, you can create this extra little node and it just tidies things up a little bit. I'll do the same here, so Shift, right click and drag, and just move that using the G key. And I think that just looks a little bit neater. We'll put this one in this node group as well. There we go, and that's just tidied things up a little bit. So join me in the next video and we're going to create a sand shader. I'll see you then.